The sun was setting over a bustling tourist hotspot, nestled in the heart of a small mountain village. Families wandered between food stands, and children played by the edge of a tranquil park. Amidst the chatter and laughter, a scruffy stray dog with matted fur and soulful brown eyes padded cautiously along the cobblestone path. He had no collar, no owner in sight, just a frail body that told the story of survival against all odds. The locals called him Max. He was a familiar sight, a harmless presence known for wagging his tail at passers-by, hoping for scraps of food or a kind pat on the head. But to a group of visiting tourists, he was nothing more than a nuisance. It started innocently enough, a few curious glances, children pointing and giggling. Then one young man, emboldened by the laughter of his peers, bent down and picked up a rock. The first throw startled Max, who yelped and backed away, his tail tucked between his legs. A second stone hit him near his ribs, and he whimpered, trying to escape the onslaught. The group laughed as they threw more rocks, their mockery drowning out the occasional protests from onlookers who didn't dare intervene. Max limped toward the edge of the park, his eyes darting around for safety. He wasn't just fleeing the stones, he was running from the sting of betrayal by the very humans he'd trusted. What no one in that park knew, not the tourists, not the locals, was that Max wasn't just a stray. He had once belonged to someone extraordinary, someone who would have moved heaven and earth to protect him. Max's former owner was a retired army general, a man who had seen war but had found his greatest comfort in the quiet loyalty of his dog. And now, miles away, that same man was about to learn what had happened to his faithful companion. Max's story, and the events that would soon unfold, would remind everyone in that village, and far beyond, of the true meaning of loyalty, justice, and redemption. As night fell over the village, Max found refuge beneath a wooden bench in a secluded corner of the park. The cold air stung his wounds, and his breathing was labored. The stars above seemed indifferent to his pain, twinkling as if nothing had changed in the world. But change was on its way, closer than anyone expected. About 50 miles from the village, retired Army General Thomas Bennett sat in his modest study, a steaming cup of tea in his hand. His life had slowed considerably since his days of commanding soldiers. The medals and commendations on his walls told the story of a man who had lived through unimaginable trials, but the framed photographs on his desk told a different story, a softer one. Among them was a picture of Max as a lively pup, with wide eyes full of curiosity and a tail that never seemed to stop wagging. Max had been his companion for years, joining him on countless hikes through the countryside. But when General Bennett had fallen ill and needed prolonged care, he had no choice but to leave Max with a trusted friend in the neighboring village. He hadn't seen Max in over a year, though he often thought of him, wondering if he was thriving as he had hoped. That night, however, an unexpected call shattered his quiet routine. It was Claire, a local shopkeeper in the village where Max had been staying. Her voice trembled with urgency as she explained what had happened. "General, it's Max. I think you should come here. Something terrible happened in the park." Thomas's heart sank. "Max? What do you mean? Is he hurt?" Claire hesitated. "A group of tourists? Well, they threw rocks at him. He's alive, but he's hurt. He's hiding somewhere in the park." The general didn't need to hear another word. He hung up, grabbed his coat, and prepared to leave. His years of military discipline kicked in, his movements precise despite the growing fury in his chest. Max wasn't just a dog to him. He was family. Meanwhile, back in the village, the tourists who had thrown the rocks continued their evening as if nothing had happened. They laughed over drinks at a local tavern, recounting their adventure with no remorse. The locals who had witnessed the incident shook their heads in disgust, but felt powerless to confront them. Thomas arrived in the village just before midnight, his presence immediately commanding attention. Even in casual clothes, his posture and sharp gaze hinted at his formidable past. He went straight to Claire's shop, where she met him with a flashlight and a bag of food. "He was last seen near the park," she said. "I've been looking, but I didn't want to scare him off." Thomas nodded, his face set like stone. Together they made their way to the park, the quiet of the night amplifying the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel. They called out softly, their voices carrying through the still air. "Max, it's me, buddy, it's okay." At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, a faint rustle came from beneath the bench. Thomas crouched down, shining his flashlight gently. The sight that greeted him broke his heart. Max lay curled up, his fur matted with dirt and specks of blood. His once bright eyes were dull with pain and fear. But the moment he saw Thomas, something shifted. His tail gave a feeble wag, as if to say, "I knew you'd come." Thomas reached out slowly, his voice steady and soothing. "Hey, boy, I'm here now. You're safe." Max whimpered, but didn't resist, as Thomas wrapped him in a soft blanket. He carried him back to Claire's shop, where they cleaned his wounds and gave him warm food. As Max drifted off to sleep, his head resting on Thomas's lap, the general's mind raced. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty. It was an attack on a creature who embodied loyalty and love. And Thomas wasn't the kind of man to let something like that go unanswered. The next morning, word of Thomas's arrival spread quickly through the village. The tourists, now sober and slightly nervous, began to hear whispers of the retired army general who had come for his dog. Their bravado wavered, but they dismissed the concerns with smug confidence. "What's he going to do? It's just a dog," one of them sneered. But they underestimated Thomas Bennett. By mid-morning, he had spoken to every witness in the park and gathered enough details to identify the perpetrators. With his military precision and commanding presence, he coordinated with the local authorities, ensuring that justice would be served. However, for Thomas, this was about more than punishment. It was about redemption. He wanted the tourists to understand the weight of their actions, to face the pain they had inflicted, and grow from it. And so, he began to formulate a plan, one that would leave a lasting impression not just on them but on the entire village. The morning sunlight filtered through the trees as Thomas stepped out of Claire's shop, Max resting inside on a soft bed. Though Max was still weak, there was a noticeable spark in his eyes that hadn't been there the night before. The villagers, who had grown curious about Thomas's presence, gathered quietly nearby, watching the general with a mix of awe and apprehension. Thomas addressed them with calm authority. "I've identified the people responsible for harming Max, but this isn't just about them. It's about us as a community. We can't allow cruelty like this to go unchecked. Not here, not anywhere." The crowd murmured in agreement. Many villagers had felt ashamed that no one had stepped in to stop the incident. It wasn't just the tourists who needed to learn a lesson. It was everyone who had witnessed the cruelty and turned a blind eye. That afternoon, Thomas set his plan into motion. He arranged a meeting with the village mayor and the local constable, laying out his proposal. It wasn't just about arresting the tourists, it was about creating an opportunity for education and accountability. The mayor, a pragmatic man who respected Thomas's reputation, agreed. Meanwhile, Thomas paid a visit to the tavern where the tourists were staying. The atmosphere shifted the moment he walked in. His presence was magnetic, his gaze sharp enough to cut through the air. The group of 4 men and 2 women who had tormented Max sat at a corner table, their laughter faltering as they noticed him. Thomas approached them without hesitation. "You must be the ones I've been looking for." One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, leaned back in his chair with forced bravado. "And who's asking?" "Thomas Bennett," he replied simply, his voice steady. "Retired general. And the owner of the dog you hurt." The room fell silent. A waitress froze mid-step, her tray trembling slightly in her hands. The tourists exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence beginning to wane. "We didn't know it was your dog," one of the women said, her voice defensive. "That's not the point," Thomas replied, his tone calm but unyielding. "It doesn't matter whose dog it was. What matters is that you thought it was acceptable to harm an innocent creature. That speaks to your character or lack thereof." The tall man smirked, trying to reclaim some control. "Look, it's just a dog. Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" Thomas leaned in slightly, his eyes locking onto the man's. "It's never just a dog. It's about respect for life, for others, and for yourself. And if you can't understand that, then I'll make sure you do." Before the man could respond, Thomas straightened up and stepped back. "You have an opportunity here. You can face the consequences of your actions the easy way, or you can do it the hard way. But either way, you will face them." With that, he turned and left, leaving the tourists to stew in their unease. That evening, the village square was transformed. Lanterns were strung up, and chairs were arranged in a semicircle around a small stage. News of Thomas's initiative had spread, and nearly everyone in the village had gathered to see what would happen. The tourists arrived reluctantly, escorted by the constable. They looked nervous but defiant, clearly unsure of what to expect. Thomas stepped onto the stage, his commanding presence silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "Thank you all for being here. Tonight isn't about punishment, it's about understanding, about looking at ourselves and asking what kind of people we want to be." He gestured to a screen set up beside him. With a nod, Claire, who was operating the projector, began a slideshow of photographs. Each image told a story. Dogs and other animals rescued from neglect and abuse. Their injuries and scars a stark reminder of human cruelty. The audience gasped at the sight of some of the images, their discomfort palpable. "This is what happens when we forget our humanity," Thomas said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "When we treat life as disposable. When we fail to stand up for what's right." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he turned to the tourists. "You've seen the consequences of actions like yours, but it doesn't have to end there. You have the chance to make it right." The tall man from the tavern scoffed. "And how exactly do you expect us to do that?" Thomas smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "You're going to spend the next 2 weeks helping this community rebuild its animal shelter. You'll care for the creatures you once thought of as insignificant, and in the process, you might just learn something about yourselves." The tourists exchanged incredulous looks. "For you can't force us to do that," one of the women protested. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You're right, I can't force you. But if you refuse, I'll ensure that the authorities back home know exactly what kind of people you are. And trust me, that will follow you for a long time." The weight of his words hung in the air. Slowly, the tourists nodded, their resistance crumbling under the combined pressure of Thomas's authority and their own guilt. The next morning, the tourists gathered reluctantly at the village's animal shelter. It was a modest building in dire need of repairs. Fences were broken, kennels rusted, and supplies scattered in disarray. The faint smell of hay and disinfectant lingered in the air, mingling with the soft barks and whimpers of the shelter's residents. Thomas stood waiting for them, arms crossed, with Claire and a few volunteers by his side. "Well," Thomas said, his voice firm but measured, "this is where you'll be working, 2 weeks from dawn until dusk. You'll clean, repair, and feed the animals. You'll learn what it means to care for lives you've taken for granted." The group exchanged glances, their earlier defiance replaced by a mix of discomfort and unease. The tall man, who had been the most vocal the previous evening, muttered under his breath, "We're not exactly handy." Claire stepped forward, her warm but no-nonsense demeanor cutting through their hesitance. "Good thing we're here to teach you. Grab some gloves and follow me. Time to get started." The tourists shuffled behind Claire as she led them toward the storage area, where brooms, shovels, and other cleaning tools awaited. Thomas watched them go, his expression unreadable. Beside him, a volunteer named Jack chuckled softly. "Think they'll last 2 days?" Jack asked. Thomas's lips twitched in what might have been a faint smile. "They'll last. Whether they change is up to them." The first day was grueling. The tourists were tasked with cleaning the kennels and feeding the animals, a process far messier and more time-consuming than they'd anticipated. Claire kept a close eye on them, stepping in to correct sloppy work or show them how to handle the animals safely. Despite their grumbles and complaints, the tourists gradually fell into a rhythm, the initial awkwardness of the task giving way to begrudging effort. By midday, the group gathered under a shady tree for a short break. Their faces were flushed from the sun, their clothes streaked with dirt and sweat. A small terrier approached one of the women, tail wagging hesitantly. She froze, unsure of how to react. "It's okay," Claire encouraged, kneeling beside the dog. "He's just saying hello. Hold out your hand so he can sniff it." The woman hesitated but eventually extended her hand. The terrier sniffed it cautiously before giving a tentative lick. A small, almost imperceptible smile flickered across her face. "I didn't think they'd be this gentle." "They're like people," Claire said. "You show them kindness and they'll give it back tenfold." That evening, Thomas reviewed the day's progress with Claire and Jack. The tourists had cleaned half the kennels, repaired a section of the fencing, and started organizing the shelter's cluttered storage area. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. "They're rough around the edges," Claire admitted, sipping a cup of tea. "But I think there's hope for a few of them." Jack snorted. "A few's being generous. The big guy, what's his name, Derek? He spent more time complaining than working. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. People don't change overnight, but they do change when they're shown the right path. As they spoke, Max limped into the room, his gait still stiff but improving. He padded over to Thomas, resting his head on the man's knee. Thomas scratched behind Max's ears absent-mindedly, his focus on the conversation. "And if they don't change?" Jack asked, his tone skeptical. Thomas's hand stilled. "Then at least we'll know we gave them the chance." Over the next few days, small cracks began to form in the tourists' defenses. The tall man, Derek, who had been the most resistant, found himself paired with Jack to fix the broken fences. Though he grumbled about the task, he listened carefully as Jack showed him how to measure and cut the planks. By the end of the day, Derek stood back, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed the newly repaired section of fencing. "Not bad," Jack said grudgingly. "Might even hold up in a storm." Derek managed a sheepish grin. "Guess I've got a knack for this after all." Meanwhile, the woman who had hesitated with the terrier, a quiet redhead named Lisa, seemed to grow more comfortable around the animals. She volunteered to help feed the puppies, spending her breaks sitting in their pen and letting them climb into her lap. By the end of the week, one of the puppies had grown particularly attached to her, following her around wherever she went. The villagers, initially skeptical of Thomas's plan, began to notice the changes. Tourists who had once been seen as threats were now repairing fences, organizing supplies, and helping the shelter run more smoothly than it had in years. Slowly but surely, the hostility that had hung over the village began to lift. On the 7th day, Thomas gathered the group for a meeting. The tourists sat on overturned crates, their postures less defensive than before. "You've made progress," Thomas said. "But this isn't just about fixing fences or cleaning kennels. It's about understanding what brought you here in the first place." The group was silent, their expressions thoughtful. For the first time, Derek spoke without sarcasm. "We acted like idiots. No excuses for it. But I guess we're trying to make it right." Thomas nodded, his expression softening. "That's all anyone can ask for." The next phase of the tourists' rehabilitation brought unexpected challenges. While their work had improved, tensions still simmered under the surface. Derek, despite his newfound competence with tools, remained quick to snap at others when frustrated. Lisa's growing bond with the animals had earned her teasing from another member of the group, a sharp-tongued woman named Karen, who often questioned why Lisa spent so much time with the dogs instead of focusing on the real work. It wasn't long before the friction boiled over. One afternoon, as Derek struggled to hammer in a stubborn nail for a new kennel frame, Karen passed by carrying a bucket of water. "Maybe if you hit the nail instead of the wood, it'd actually go in," she quipped. Derek straightened, his jaw tightening. "You want to try? Be my guest." "Unlike you, I know my limits," Karen shot back. "I stick to what I'm good at, like keeping things clean, which is more than I can say for your sloppy work." Before Derek could respond, Lisa intervened, stepping between them. "Enough. We're all tired, but snapping at each other isn't helping." Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, of course. Saint Lisa, defender of puppies and people. What would we do without you?" Lisa's cheeks reddened, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she turned to Derek. "Come on, let's finish this so we can call it a day." Karen muttered something under her breath as she walked away, leaving Derek and Lisa to exchange wary glances. "She's been like that since day one," Derek grumbled. "Don't know why she even bothers." "Maybe because she's trying in her own way," Lisa said quietly. "We all have stuff we're dealing with." That evening, Thomas and Claire called the group together. The fire pit crackled softly as they gathered around, the warm light casting long shadows on the ground. "I know this hasn't been easy," Thomas began, his voice steady but firm. "But part of this process is learning to work together. You can't rebuild a shelter or yourselves if you're constantly at each other's throats." Karen crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on the fire. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Lisa sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap. "Tomorrow," Claire added, "we're going to change things up. Instead of dividing the work, you'll all work together on a single project, a new play area for the dogs. It's a big task, and it'll take all of you to finish it." The group exchanged uncertain looks. The idea of working in close quarters after the day's arguments didn't sit well with any of them. "This isn't just about building a play area," Thomas continued. "It's about learning to communicate, to support each other. If you can't do that, then all this," he gestured around the shelter, "means nothing." The next morning, the group gathered near a plot of land behind the shelter, where supplies for the play area had been laid out. Piles of wood, bags of cement, and brightly colored ropes and toys waited to be assembled into something functional and fun. Thomas assigned roles. Derek and Karen would handle the framework for the climbing structure, while Lisa and another member of the group, a reserved man named Chris, would work on setting up the obstacle course. Claire would oversee the entire process, stepping in only if necessary. At first, the tension was palpable. Derek and Karen avoided speaking to each other, communicating only through curt nods and gestures. Lisa, meanwhile, tried to engage Chris in conversation, but his responses were monosyllabic at best. As the day wore on, small breakthroughs began to emerge. Derek, struggling to lift a heavy beam into place, reluctantly called for Karen's help. She hesitated, then stepped forward, holding the beam steady as he secured it with nails. "Thanks," Derek muttered. Karen shrugged, her expression softening slightly. "Don't mention it." Nearby, Lisa managed to coax a smile out of Chris by sharing an anecdote about one of the shelter's clumsier puppies. "He tried to chase his tail and ended up tumbling into the water bowl," she said, laughing. Chris's lips twitched into a faint grin. "Sounds like he's got more energy than I do," Chris said. It was the most he'd spoken all week. By late afternoon, the play area began to take shape. The climbing structure stood tall, its beams securely fastened. The obstacle course, complete with tunnels and ramps, looked almost professional. Ropes and toys hung from posts, ready for the dogs to enjoy. As the group stepped back to admire their work, a sense of pride replaced the exhaustion on their faces. "You did good," Claire said, her tone approving, "and you did it together." Derek looked over at Karen's, who gave him a small nod. Lisa and Chris exchanged smiles. For the first time, the group felt like more than just a collection of individuals. They felt like a team. Thomas approached, Max trotting faithfully at his side. The dog sniffed the new play area curiously, before giving an excited bark and wagging his tail. "I think Max approves," Thomas said, a rare smile breaking across his face. "Well, that's not something he gives lightly." The group laughed, the tension of the past few days finally melting away. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they knew that while their work wasn't finished, they had taken an important step, not just in building the shelter, but in rebuilding themselves. As the days turned into weeks, the group settled into a rhythm. They began to find small joys in their work and the presence of the animals, who responded to their care with unguarded affection. But with progress came deeper challenges, as unresolved emotions bubbled to the surface. Derek, who had become one of the most dependable workers, found himself drawn to Max, the shelter's most guarded dog. Max had started following Derek during his tasks, watching him hammer nails or carry heavy bags of dog food with quiet curiosity. Despite the dog's initial wariness, Derek saw a reflection of himself in Max's cautious but hopeful gaze. One afternoon, while cleaning the kennels, Derek noticed Max lingering near the door. He crouched down, holding out his hand. "Hey, buddy," Derek said softly. "You checking up on me?" Max hesitated, his ears twitching. Slowly, he stepped closer, his nose brushing Derek's hand. It was a small moment, but for Derek, it felt monumental. He had spent so long believing he didn't deserve trust or connection. And now here was Max, damaged but resilient, offering him a sliver of both. Lisa, on the other hand, faced her own struggles. Her bond with the shelter's newest arrival, a timid puppy named Daisy, had grown deeper by the day. Daisy had been found abandoned in a nearby field, her ribs visible under her thin coat and her eyes wide with fear. Lisa spent hours sitting near Daisy's kennel, coaxing her with soft words and gentle touches. Daisy's tail wagged tentatively whenever Lisa approached, a sign of progress that filled Lisa with pride. Yet, it also stirred feelings she wasn't ready to face. One evening, as the group gathered for dinner, Lisa grew uncharacteristically quiet. Karen, who had begun softening toward Lisa after their earlier clashes, nudged her gently. "Something on your mind?" Karen asked. Lisa hesitated, then sighed. "Daisy reminds me of a dog I had growing up," she admitted. "Her name was Bella. She was my best friend." "What happened to her?" Karen asked, her tone uncharacteristically soft. Lisa's voice wavered. When things got rough at home, I had to leave. I couldn't take Bella with me. She ended up in a shelter. I always wondered what happened to her. The group fell silent, the weight of Lisa's confession settling over them. That's why you're so good with Daisy, Karen said after a moment. You know what it's like to be abandoned? Lisa nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I just don't want her to feel like I let her down. Meanwhile, Karen found herself grappling with her own emotional barriers. Despite her outward confidence, she struggled with feelings of inadequacy. She had taken on the role of organizing supplies and schedules, excelling in a way she hadn't anticipated. Yet every compliment from Claire or Thomas felt like a reminder of how far she'd fallen before arriving at the shelter. One night, as she sat alone by the fire, Thomas approached, carrying 2 mugs of steaming tea. Mind if I join you? He asked. Karen shrugged. It's a free country. Thomas sat down, his gaze thoughtful. You've been doing good work. The others look up to you. Karen scoffed. Yeah, right. I'm just bossy enough to keep them in line. It's more than that, Thomas said. You've taken charge in ways most people wouldn't. That's leadership, Karen. And I think it scares you. Karen stared into the flames, her defenses slipping. It's just, when you mess up as badly as I have, it's hard to believe you can do anything right. Thomas nodded, his expression empathetic. I get that. But you're here, aren't you? Doing something that matters. That says more about who you are than any mistake you've made. Karen didn't respond, but a flicker of hope sparked in her eyes. As the group navigated their individual struggles, a new challenge emerged. An incoming storm threatened to damage the shelter's fragile structures. Thomas gathered everyone in the common area to discuss their plan. The storm's going to hit hard, he said. We need to secure the kennels and move the most vulnerable animals inside. The group sprang into action, their teamwork now fluid and instinctive. Derek and Karen worked side by side to reinforce the outdoor structures, their earlier animosity replaced by mutual respect. Lisa focused on calming Daisy, who trembled as the wind began to howl. Even Chris, who often kept to himself, joined in, his quiet determination inspiring others. As the storm raged outside, the group huddled in the main building, surrounded by the animals they had worked so hard to protect. The power flickered, but their spirits held steady. In the dim light, Derek spoke up. You know, I used to think I was useless, but being here, seeing what we've done, it's starting to feel like I'm worth something. Lisa nodded, her hand resting on Daisy's head. Me too. Karen, for once, said nothing, but her small smile spoke volumes. Thomas looked around the room, his heart swelling with pride. You've all come a long way, he said. And this is just the beginning. The storm passed, leaving a trail of minor destruction in its wake. Fallen branches littered the grounds, and the outdoor kennels had sustained damage despite their best efforts. But the shelter and the animals had weathered the worst. As the group ventured outside to assess the damage, they couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. For the first time, they had faced a challenge as a cohesive unit and come out stronger for it. However, as the morning light illuminated the grounds, a chilling discovery shattered their brief respite. Derek was the first to notice the footprints. They were human, large and clearly recent, leading from the outer perimeter toward the kennels. His stomach tightened as he followed the trail, calling out for Thomas. Thomas, you need to see this. The others gathered quickly, their expressions shifting from relief to unease as Derek pointed to the footprints. They followed the trail together, which led to a section of the kennels where the fence had been tampered with. One of the latches hung loose, as though it had been deliberately cut. Lisa gasped. Someone tried to break in. Karen examined the latch, her jaw tightening. Not tried. They did, but why? Thomas's face darkened. Let's check on the animals. The group spread out, frantically inspecting each kennel. To their immense relief, all the dogs and cats were accounted for, though several animals seemed unusually agitated. Max, in particular, growled softly, pacing in his enclosure with his ears pinned back. This doesn't make sense, Karen muttered. Why would someone break in and then leave without taking anything? Lisa looked toward the tree line, her voice trembling. What if they weren't after the animals? What if they were after us? A heavy silence fell over the group. The idea hung in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. That evening, Thomas called a meeting in the common area. The room felt colder than usual, the flickering firelight casting long shadows on the walls. Everyone sat close together, their earlier camaraderie now laced with tension. "We need to be prepared," Thomas said, his voice steady but firm. "Whoever was out there might come back. Until we know more, we can't take any chances." "What do we do?" Lisa asked, holding Daisy protectively in her lap. "For starters, we'll secure the grounds," Thomas replied. "Karen, Derek, and I will reinforce the fences and install motion sensor lights. Lisa, I need you to focus on keeping the animals calm. Chris, you'll help monitor the cameras." Karen crossed her arms. "And what if they do come back? What then?" Thomas met her gaze evenly. "We'll deal with it together." The group nodded, though unease lingered in their eyes. As they dispersed to their tasks, Lisa lingered behind, watching Thomas thoughtfully. "Do you think it could be him?" she asked hesitantly. Thomas's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but we're not taking any chances." The following days were a blur of activity. Derek and Karen worked tirelessly to fortify the shelter's defenses, their banter from earlier weeks replaced by a quiet determination. They erected additional barriers around the kennels and installed the lights Thomas had ordered. Each flick of a hammer and twist of a wrench felt like a small victory against the unknown threat. Lisa spent her time with the animals, particularly Daisy, whose anxiety seemed to mirror her own. She spoke softly to the puppy, her voice a balm against the tension in the air. "It's okay, Daisy," she murmured, stroking the dog's soft fur. "We'll keep you safe. I promise." Meanwhile, Chris manned the surveillance equipment, his sharp eyes scanning the grainy footage for any sign of intruders. He seemed oddly at ease in his role, as though the act of watching provided him with a sense of control he hadn't felt in years. But it was Thomas who bore the brunt of the group's unease. He moved from task to task with a calm efficiency, but his eyes betrayed the weight of responsibility he carried. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of wind outside, seemed to put him on edge. Late one night, as the others slept, Thomas stood watch by the window. The motion sensor lights outside cast eerie pools of light across the grounds, illuminating the swaying trees and empty kennels. He sipped his coffee, his thoughts swirling with possibilities. The creak of a floorboard behind him made him turn sharply. It was Karen clutching a blanket around her shoulders. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "Too much on my mind." Karen joined him at the window, her gaze fixed on the dark woods. "You think it's over?" "No," Thomas admitted, "but we're ready if it's not." Karen hesitated, then said, "You know, you've got a knack for this." "For what?" "Leading, keeping us together, making us feel like we're not just a bunch of screw-ups." Thomas chuckled softly. "You're not screw-ups, Karen. You're survivors, and survivors don't give up." Karen didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. As dawn broke over the shelter, Chris burst into the common area, his face pale. "Guys, you need to see this," he said, holding up his laptop. The group gathered around the screen, where footage from the previous night played. At first, it showed nothing unusual, just the swaying trees and the occasional flicker of the motion sensor lights. But then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., a shadow moved across the frame. That wasn't an animal. It was a person. The figure paused near the kennels, silhouetted against the faint light. They appeared to be holding something, a long, thin object, but the image was too blurry to make out any details. So after a few moments, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. "What the hell were they doing?" Karen demanded. Thomas's face hardened. "I don't know, but it's time we found out." The group sat in tense silence, the grainy footage still playing on Chris's laptop. The mysterious figure's fleeting appearance had thrown a shadow over the fragile sense of security they had worked so hard to build. Questions hung in the air, unspoken but heavy with implication. Thomas broke the silence. "Whoever this is, they're not just passing through. They know the shelter, they know the layout, and they know how to avoid the cameras." Karen crossed her arms. "So what's the plan? We can't just wait around for them to make the next move." "I agree," Derek added. "We need to take action." Thomas nodded. "We will. But first, we need more information. Chris, can you enhance the footage? Try to get a clearer look at what they're holding." Chris frowned, tapping at his keyboard. "I'll try, but don't expect miracles." This isn't CSI. As Chris worked while the others gathered around the table to strategize, Thomas's calm voice anchored them, weaving their individual ideas into a cohesive plan. The group divided their tasks. Karen and Derek were tasked with patrolling the grounds, keeping watch for any signs of activity. Lisa and Chris would focus on fortifying the shelter's entrances and improving camera angles to eliminate blind spots. Thomas would dig into the shelter's history, searching for clues that might explain why they had become a target. It was Lisa who broke the tension with an unexpected suggestion. "What if we use Max?" The group turned to her, puzzled. "Use him how?" Thomas asked. "Well," Lisa began hesitantly, "he's the only one who's acted differently since the break-in. Maybe he can sense something we can't. Dogs are perceptive like that." Karen shrugged. "It's not the worst idea. Max is sharp, and if he's picking up on something, we should pay attention." Thomas considered this for a moment. "All right, but we keep him on a leash and close to the group. No risks." Lisa's face lit up with determination. "I'll take care of him." That evening, Thomas retreated to the office to pore over old files. The shelter had been a fixture in the community for decades, but its history was far from spotless. Financial troubles, disputes over land ownership, and even a few past break-ins painted a picture of a place that had faced more than its share of challenges. As Thomas sifted through the records, he found a faded newspaper clipping tucked between some invoices. The headline read, "Local shelter faces closure amid legal battle." The article detailed a bitter dispute between the shelter's founder and a neighboring property owner. The dispute had been resolved years ago, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it might be connected to their current troubles. Outside, Karen and Derek patrolled the grounds, their flashlights casting long beams across the frost-covered grass. The cold night air was heavy with silence, every rustle of leaves setting their nerves on edge. "Do you think it's the same person from the footage?" Derek asked, breaking the quiet. Karen tightened her grip on the flashlight. "Probably, but what worries me more is why they're coming back." Derek hesitated before asking, "You think this is personal?" Karen stopped walking, her expression unreadable. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just someone trying to scare us off. Either way, they're messing with the wrong people." Meanwhile, Lisa and Chris worked on adjusting the cameras. Max sat patiently beside Lisa, his ears twitching at every sound. Lisa couldn't help but talk to him as she worked, her voice soothing. "You're a brave boy, Max," she murmured. "I bet you'd protect all of us if it came to that." Max tilted his head, as if understanding her words. His calm presence was a comfort, a reminder that not everything was spiraling out of control. Chris glanced over. "Are you good with him? He listens to you." Lisa smiled faintly. "He's just scared, like the rest of us. I think he knows we're trying to help." Chris hesitated, then said, "You're stronger than you think, you know." "We all see it." Lisa blinked, surprised by the unexpected compliment. "Thanks, Chris. That means a lot." By midnight, the group reconvened in the common area. Thomas shared his findings, laying the newspaper clipping on the table. "There's a history here," he explained. "A land dispute that almost shut the shelter down years ago. The owner who fought against it lost, but maybe they, or someone connected to them, hasn't let it go." Karen frowned. "You think this is some kind of grudge?" "It's possible," Thomas admitted, "but we don't have enough to go on yet." Chris spoke up. "I enhanced the footage as much as I could. It's still blurry, but whatever they're holding, it looks like a crowbar." The group exchanged uneasy glances. A crowbar was more than just a tool. It was a weapon. "We need to be ready," Thomas said firmly. "No more waiting. If they come back, we'll be prepared." As the others dispersed, Lisa lingered by Max's kennel, her fingers brushing his fur. She whispered softly, "We'll keep you safe, Max. All of you." Thomas watched her from a distance, his mind churning with possibilities. Whoever was behind this wasn't just threatening the shelter, they were threatening the fragile sense of hope that had taken root within the group, and Thomas wasn't about to let that happen. The shelter fell into an uneasy rhythm over the next few days. The group carried on with their responsibilities, but an undercurrent of anxiety rippled through their interactions. Everyone knew the next encounter wasn't a matter of if, it was when. Thomas took steps to prepare the shelter for the worst. The doors were reinforced with extra locks, the security cameras were realigned, and Chris even rigged a motion-sensitive alarm using parts salvaged from old equipment. Despite their efforts, the feeling of vulnerability lingered. It was late one evening when the first sign of trouble appeared. Karen was in the common room, flipping through an old paperback, when Max suddenly bolted upright in his kennel. His ears were pinned back, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. "Max," Karen called softly, setting her book aside. She moved closer to him, noticing his focused gaze toward the front gate. The growl escalated into sharp barks, loud and insistent. "What is it, boy?" Karen murmured. She reached for her phone to alert the others. The group quickly assembled, Thomas at the lead with a flashlight in hand. Chris monitored the security cameras from his laptop, while Lisa stayed close to Max, her hands trembling slightly as she held his leash. Karen and Derek flanked the main door, both armed with heavy flashlights that could double as blunt objects if necessary. "Anything on the cameras?" Thomas asked Chris. Chris's fingers danced across the keyboard. "Wait, there!" He pointed to the screen. The grainy footage showed a shadow moving just beyond the range of the lights, pacing near the shelter's fence line. "Whoever it is, they're testing us," Derek muttered, his grip tightening on his flashlight. Thomas nodded grimly. "They're probing for weaknesses. Stay sharp." Outside, the night was eerily silent. The wind had picked up, rattling the bare tree branches, and the distant hum of traffic was barely audible. Thomas led the way toward the fence, his flashlight sweeping across the ground. The beam caught something, boot prints in the damp soil. "They've been here," he said, crouching to inspect the tracks, "and they're not small. Whoever this is, they're big, strong." Lisa shivered, clutching Max's leash tighter. The dog was pulling against her, his nose pointed toward the far corner of the yard. "He smells something," Lisa whispered. "Something close." The group followed Max's lead, their footsteps crunching softly on the frosty grass. As they rounded the corner, the motion alarm Chris had set up suddenly blared, its piercing wail cutting through the night. Everyone froze. "There," Karen hissed, pointing toward the shadows near the storage shed. The beam of Thomas's flashlight swept over a figure, tall and hooded, crouched near the shed's door. The person froze for a split second before bolting, their heavy boots pounding against the ground. "Stop!" Thomas shouted, breaking into a sprint. Karen and Derek followed, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran. Lisa stayed back with Max, her heart racing as she watched the scene unfold. The intruder was fast, but Thomas was faster. He closed the gap quickly, tackling the figure near the edge of the fence. They both went down hard, the sound of their struggle echoing in the stillness. "Get off me!" the intruder snarled, thrashing violently. Thomas held firm, using his weight to pin the person to the ground. Karen and Derek arrived seconds later, helping to secure the intruder. The hood fell back, revealing a weathered face, sharp with anger but tinged with desperation. "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, his voice low and controlled. The man glared up at him. "None of your business." "It became our business the moment you started stalking this place," Karen snapped. The man's eyes flicked between them, calculating his next move, but he was outnumbered and outmatched. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea what you're protecting." They hauled the man back to the shelter, keeping a firm grip on him as they entered the common room. Chris looked up from his laptop, his eyes widening at the sight. "Who's this?" he asked. "We were hoping he'd tell us," Thomas replied, pushing the man into a chair. Lisa approached cautiously, Max at her side. The dog's growls had subsided, but his eyes were locked on the stranger, his body tense and alert. "What do you want with us?" Lisa asked softly. The man's gaze flicked to her, then to Max. "It's not you I want," he said cryptically. "It's what's under this place." The group exchanged confused looks. "Under," Thomas pressed. The man smirked. "You really don't know, do you?" "Figures. They never told you the whole story." Thomas leaned in, his voice steady but firm. "What story? Start talking." The man hesitated, then sighed. "This shelter. It wasn't always a shelter. Decades ago, this land was part of a government project. They buried things here." "Dangerous things." Karen crossed her arms. "You expect us to believe that?" "I don't care what you believe," the man shot back. "But you've got something down there that could ruin a lot of people. People who don't take kindly to loose ends." The room fell into a heavy silence as the weight of his words settled over them. "What do we do now?" Lisa whispered. Thomas straightened, his jaw set. "We find out the truth." And we protect this place no matter what. The revelation about the shelter's hidden history cast a heavy shadow over the group. The man, who eventually introduced himself as Jacob, refused to elaborate further, insisting that they were already on their way. His cryptic warnings and defiant demeanor only fueled the group's unease. Thomas paced the room, his mind racing. We need to confirm his story. If there's something under this shelter, we have to know what it is. Karen folded her arms, skeptical. And how do you suggest we do that? Start digging up the basement. Chris, still monitoring the security cameras, chimed in. If he's right, and someone's coming, we don't have time for a treasure hunt. Lisa, who had been silently watching Max, spoke up. What if Max can help? He's been leading us to things we couldn't see before. Maybe he knows something. All eyes turned to the dog, who sat alert beside Lisa, his nose twitching as though he were already picking up a scent. It's worth a try, Thomas agreed, but we need to move fast. They divided into teams. Thomas, Lisa, and Max headed for the basement, while Karen, Chris, and Derek stayed upstairs to monitor the perimeter and secure the shelter. Jacob, still bound but under Derek's watchful eye, sat silently in the corner, his expression unreadable. The basement was cold and musty, its concrete floor cracked in places. Old storage boxes and equipment were stacked haphazardly along the walls. Max moved methodically, sniffing the ground and pausing occasionally to paw at a spot before moving on. What exactly are we looking for? Lisa asked nervously. Anything out of place? Thomas replied. Hidden doors, loose floor panels, anything that doesn't belong. Max suddenly stopped in front of an old metal cabinet. He barked sharply, pawing at the ground in front of it. Thomas and Lisa exchanged a glance. Looks like he found something, Thomas said. They moved the cabinet aside, revealing a section of the floor that sounded hollow when Thomas tapped it. With a crowbar from the nearby toolbox, he pried up the loose panel, uncovering a small hatch with a rusted handle. Lisa's breath caught. What is this? Thomas crouched, examining the hatch. It looks old, definitely not part of the original shelter design. He pulled the hatch open, revealing a narrow tunnel that descended into darkness. A cold draft wafted up, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic. Lisa shivered. Are we really going down there? Before Thomas could answer, Max barked again, his nose pointed toward the tunnel. Whatever was down there, it had his full attention. We don't have a choice, Thomas said, grabbing a flashlight. Stay close. The tunnel was tight and oppressive, the walls slick with moisture. Thomas led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, while Lisa followed closely, Max at her side. The further they went, the stronger the metallic smell became. After several minutes, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. The flashlight's beam illuminated a set of rusted metal crates, their surfaces marked with faded government insignias and cryptic warning labels. Lisa hesitated. This can't be real. Thomas approached the crates cautiously, brushing away years of dust and grime. The labels were barely legible, but one word stood out clearly. Biohazard. Upstairs, Karen's voice crackled over the radio. We've got movement outside. Multiple vehicles approaching. Chris swiveled his laptop around, showing the camera feed. Black SUVs rolled up the dirt road toward the shelter, their headlights cutting through the night. They're here, Chris said grimly. Karen tightened her grip on the radio. Thomas, you need to get back up here now. In the basement chamber, Thomas and Lisa froze at the message. We need to go, Lisa urged, pulling at his arm. Thomas nodded, but his gaze lingered on the crates. Not yet. If they're here for this, we need proof. He snapped pictures of the crates with his phone, documenting every label and marking. Just as he finished, Max barked furiously, his body tense as he stared back toward the tunnel. They're coming, Lisa said, her voice trembling. Thomas grabbed her hand. Let's move. They raced back through the tunnel, Max leading the way. By the time they emerged in the basement, the sound of footsteps echoed from above, heavy, deliberate, and accompanied by muffled voices. Karen met them at the basement door, her flashlight beam jittery with adrenaline. They're inside, armed. Thomas's jaw tightened. How many? At least 6, Karen replied, and they're not here to negotiate. The group regrouped in the common room, Jacob still under guard. The sounds of boots on wood grew louder, closer. Whoever these people were, they moved with military precision. What's the plan? Chris whispered. Thomas looked around, his mind racing. We barricade the entrances and hold them off as long as we can. Lisa, take Max and the photos to a safe spot. If things go south, you're our proof. Lisa hesitated, fear and determination warring on her face. Finally, she nodded. Okay, be careful. Thomas crouched beside Max, stroking his fur. Take care of her, boy. Max licked his hand, his eyes shining with loyalty and understanding. The group braced for the inevitable confrontation. The sound of a heavy object slamming against the front door signaled the beginning of a battle none of them had anticipated. The first slam against the door was followed by a deafening silence. The group huddled together in the main room, their improvised weapons and determined faces betraying the anxiety that gripped them. Max, sitting beside Lisa in a concealed corner, let out a low growl, his ears flat against his head. Thomas adjusted his grip on the crowbar. They're trying to psych us out. Stay calm. Another slam, and the doorframe creaked under the force. Then a voice, calm, commanding, rang out from the other side. Jacob, you know why we're here. Let us in and no one has to get hurt. The group turned to Jacob, who smirked despite the tension. If you think they're bluffing, you're dead wrong. These people don't leave loose ends. Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady. We don't want any trouble. Leave now, and we'll pretend this never happened. The voice responded, colder this time. You've already made it our business. Open the door, or we'll come in. The next blow sent the door flying open, the wood splintering as armed men stormed inside. They were dressed in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks. The leader, carrying himself with the air of someone used to being obeyed, scanned the room. Secure the area, he ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. The group scattered. Thomas and Karen flipped a table, using it as cover, while Chris dove for the storage room. Lisa clutched Max, holding him back as he barked furiously, his instincts to protect overriding any fear. The intruders moved with mechanical precision, spreading out and checking every corner. One of them spotted Jacob and aimed his rifle. On your feet. Jacob raised his hands but didn't move. Took you long enough. Thought maybe you'd forgotten about me. The leader approached, his rifle trained on Jacob. You're a liability. Hand over what you know and we'll make this quick. Thomas, from behind the overturned table, shouted, He's not going anywhere with you. The leader turned, his mask concealing any emotion. You must be Thomas, always the hero. He gestured sharply to one of his men. Bring him out. Two intruders advanced toward the overturned table, rifles poised. Thomas knew he couldn't hold them off for long. Before he could act, a blur of fur and motion shot past him. Max launched himself at the nearest intruder, jaws clamping onto the man's arm with a force that made him scream. The rifle clattered to the floor. Lisa shouted, Max, no! But the dog wouldn't relent. He growled, his teeth digging deeper as the man flailed. The leader raised his weapon toward Max. Enough, he barked. Lisa threw herself into the open, hands raised. Stop! Don't hurt him. The leader hesitated, and that moment was enough for Thomas to spring into action. Grabbing the fallen rifle, he slammed its butt into the second intruder's knee, sending the man to the ground. The room erupted into chaos. Karen threw a chair at one of the attackers, giving Jacob the chance to grab a fire extinguisher. He sprayed its contents wildly, filling the room with a dense fog. The intruders faltered, their vision obscured. Everyone out! Thomas shouted. He grabbed Lisa's arm, pulling her toward the back door. As they scrambled through the fog, Max still growling and snapping at the intruders, the leader's voice rang out. Find them! Secure the exits! The group burst through the back door into the cold night air. They ran for the tree line, the sounds of shouts and footsteps growing distant. Max limped slightly but stayed at Lisa's side, his eyes scanning the darkness for any threats. Jacob turned to Thomas, panting. This isn't over. They'll track us. We'll deal with that when it happens, Thomas said firmly. For now, we get somewhere safe. The leader emerged from the smoke-filled house, his piercing gaze sweeping the area. They're running, he growled. But they won't get far. Deep in the woods, the group paused to catch their breath. Karen looked back, her voice trembling. We can't keep running forever. They're professionals. We're not going to, Thomas replied, his tone resolute. We'll make a stand. Together! Max let out a low growl, his ears perked toward the direction of the house. Lisa knelt beside him, stroking his fur. He's saved us twice tonight. We have to trust him." Jacob smirked. "Well, if the dog's got a plan, I'm all ears." Thomas stepped forward, determination written across his face. "No more running. If they want a fight, we'll give them one." The group exchanged determined glances, their fear now tempered by resolve. Max barked sharply, as if signaling his agreement. They didn't have much, but they had each other and they had Max. And sometimes, that was enough to turn the tide. The night wasn't over, but they weren't giving up. Together, they would face whatever came next. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in hues of amber and crimson, Thomas and the group worked swiftly. They used the natural terrain to their advantage, setting up makeshift barriers and positioning themselves strategically. Max, though physically a dog, seemed almost human in his understanding. He moved silently among the group, offering comfort with his presence, as if reminding them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. The intruders' voices echoed in the distance, growing louder as they approached. The group's tension was palpable, but they held their ground, each drawing strength from Max's unwavering calm. Lisa, usually reserved, whispered, "No matter what happens, we stay together." Max taught us that. Moments later, the intruders emerged from the shadows. Their leader sneered at the sight of the ragtag group, dismissing them as no threat. "You think you can stop us?" he taunted. But before he could take another step, a deep growl rumbled through the clearing. Max stepped forward, his frame illuminated by the fading sunlight, his eyes locked onto the leader, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, with a sharp bark, Max lunged, not in attack but to protect. His action startled the intruders, giving the group the opening they needed. Using the element of surprise, Thomas and the others executed their plan. A branch snapped, a stone rolled, and chaos erupted as the group pushed back against the invaders. Though the fight was fierce, their unity proved stronger. Max darted between the combatants, his presence both inspiring and distracting the intruders. One by one, the attackers faltered, disoriented by the group's resolve and the dog's relentless vigilance. Eventually, the leader, bloodied and defeated, called his men to retreat. "This isn't over," he spat, clutching his side as they stumbled back into the woods. But everyone present knew it was more bluster than promise. As silence reclaimed the forest, the group stood in a circle, catching their breath. Max trotted over to Lisa, resting his head on her lap as if to say, "It's over now." Tears streamed down her face as she stroked his fur, the emotions of the day overwhelming her. Thomas broke the silence. "We did it. Together." His voice cracked, but it was filled with pride. And it was because of Max. He reminded us of what we're capable of when we stand for what matters. In the days that followed, the group fortified their refuge, more united than ever. News of their defiance spread among nearby communities, inspiring others to stand up against similar threats. Max became a symbol, a hero whose courage transcended species, proving that love and loyalty could triumph over even the darkest of circumstances. Years later, Lisa would tell the story of Max to her children, calling him the protector of the forest. And every time she passed the old clearing where it all happened, she would pause, remembering the day they found their strength, not just in themselves, but in each other. Did this story move you? If so, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of the power of loyalty and courage. And stay tuned, there's always another incredible tale waiting to be told.